whatever the horrible statistic is, like 1 in 4 or something mad like that, of American babies who are put into daycare at 2 weeks old is just horrendous. That's absolutely not an age at which babies should be separated from their mothers. I mean, it's not even legal to separate puppies from their mothers at 2 weeks old. So, why we imagine it would be okay to do that to human children who develop so much more slowly is completely beyond me. It's barbarous.
My guest on this occasion is Mary Harrington, who's a very thoughtful and very honest person who displays great courage, I have to say. She's a contributing editor at Unheard in the United Kingdom. She writes for other outlets as well, including First Things, The New Statesman, and her own Substack, where she writes regularly. She's also just published her first book, Feminism Against Progress. I think you'll enjoy this. Mary, thank you so much for joining us. And can we kick off? I understand that your grandmother gave you some advice that you've never forgotten and that impacted your life once. Can I ask what that was and why it was so powerful?
My grandmother was a very practical woman. She was a doctor. She was a farmer. She was a mum. She got on with stuff the whole life. She was never idle, and she always saw life as it was, I thought. And she was quite old by the time she gave that advice. I think she was already in a retirement home, but she and I were great friends. We always were, all through my adult life. I remember when I was at university, I'd ring her on a Sunday and we'd do the big cryptic crossword for the weekend down the phone together. So she was a great friend. And one day when I was I think I was sort of late-ish 20s, I went to visit her and I told her what was going on in my life. She sort of paused and looked at me after a moment or two, she said, Mary, I think you should grow your hair and get married. It was great. I mean, it was excellent advice as it turned out. I did. And as it turned out, she was right. But it sort of took me by surprise at the time because I had very short hair. I was very much not married. I was living in assorted, sketchy house shares and sort of commune type setups and leading a very experimental sort of life, which was fun and interesting. And her advice was timely because it hit on something I hadn't really been able to put into words at the time, which was that it was starting to become less fun. As I got older, living like that stopped feeling as though it could go on forever. And it was beginning to dawn on me, I think, although I don't know that I'd have put it like this to myself, but it was beginning to dawn on me that I was getting older. And that leading an experimental, communitarian, avant-garde-ish sort of life might not be as fun by the time I was, 45 or 60 or older as it was when I was 24. And I don't think I sort of went away and ruminated. I didn't spend lots of time thinking, right, and I didn't abruptly make any changes the next day, but it stuck with me. It must have stuck with me, and it must have had an impact on me. I think what Grandma was trying to say, and she was very, as I said, she was a very practical person, very clever, but also very practical. Was, have you considered being normal? Which I honestly hadn't up to that point. I think I had sincerely not considered being normal as an available option. It just seemed obvious to me that the way to live was in defiance or in contravention of any kind of expected social norms, or expected that doing it like that just wasn't going to work for me. It was going to be boring and dull and stuffy and conformist and etc., etc., etc. And that the obvious ethical, experimental, avant-garde-ish thing to do was to try and devise a set of principles for me for living from scratch. That that was the obvious right and proper thing to do. I mean, I'd ingested a fair amount, I suppose, of critical theory when I was at university, which kind of underscored all of that. I was a radical leftist. I believed in flouting and thwarting and subverting the status quo. So just be normal was paradoxically very subversive advice at the time. But I tried it, and as it turned out, she was right. I mean, not least that it turns out, I think one of the great secrets of being normal is that it's actually very liberating in terms of how eccentric you then have permission to be, because you fly under the radar.
Would part of what she meant and part of your experience have been that fun's one thing, but happiness and contentedness and purpose are tied somehow to accepting responsibility, taking on and accepting and exercising responsibility?
Well, I suppose that's the conclusion I've come to since. But I think for me at the time, just to set a bit of context for your audience, I didn't. I was a very radical leftist, and I suppose I was committed to an early version of what we think of as woke now. I went on marches, and I believed in the whole anybody can be anything they say they are, or at least I wanted to try and believe it, and I had a good old experimental go at believing it, and I took my friends seriously when they said they had special pronouns, and all that. It was all in very kind of germinal form in the noughties. This was some time ago. It hadn't kind of eaten the entire culture the way it has now, and I think it was. I hadn't really thought about responsibility or contentment, because I was much more. I hadn't really thought about the relationship between responsibility and meaning and contentment, and actually being able to build anything serious in your life. Because at that point, I was too sort of constitutively allergic to the idea of hierarchy or order or really sort of authority of any kind. I suppose is the I was sort of basic in quite a basic way, like, allergic to authority. And if you're quite basically allergic to authority, the idea that actually it could add anything useful or beneficial to your life is it just doesn't compute. So and in that context, just be normal. Obviously that's not what Grandma actually said. She said, "Grow your hair and get married." But I mean, from her perspective, effectively that amounts to, can you please just be normal? Is the gentlest possible version of a suggestion that actually just fitting in with what everybody else is already doing, might actually be a route to happiness. Which, it didn't make any. It was counterintuitive to me at the time, but as it turned out, it was right. And I think, and it's. I mean, there's a lot has happened since then, John, and I've done a lot more thinking since then. But I think one of the reflections it left me with. Is just how much of the culture is dedicated to telling people that just be normal is terrible advice, which is not true. If you think about all of those kids' movies where an ant or a bee or a penguin or something, becomes a heroic figure by doing something which doesn't fit in with everybody else around them, and it's the story that gets drummed into you by from Pixar movies onwards again and again and again, that what you absolutely must not do is just be normal. What you absolutely must not do is just do what everybody expects you to do. What you absolutely must not do is fit in with the role that everybody has allotted to you, because it's not even that you'll find that frustrating, or it's almost presented as immoral or a kind of failure, an abdication of responsibility to say, okay, fine, I'll just go along with that. And everywhere the messaging says just be you, and there's an implication somehow that whatever it is that just be you means is not going to be, I'm just going to be a normal person. That's never what it means. Somehow the answer can never be, okay, I'm just going to be a conventional person who lives in the Shires, has 2 or 3 kids, and has a nice life, and hangs out with their friends. That just be you has to mean something different implicit. It has to mean something, and I don't know. I suppose I'm the kind of nerd who tries to who takes that stuff far too literally. There's a great many people who just get on with being normal anyway. Fewer maybe these days, but enough of them, thank goodness. So I took all of that far too literally and tried to have a really good go at just being myself. And as it turned out, it's terrible advice. You have a much nicer life if you make a concerted effort to be normal. And if you're an eccentric or an unusual person, that will just happen anyway. There's nothing you can do about that.
I can't help wondering what a normal person does do now to be normal, quite frankly, because it seems to me that in the age of identity politics, we're so atomised and so intent on finding ourselves from within that there is no normal and there's not much happiness either.
Well, I think it depends where you are. If you spend your time entirely on the internet, which I'm completely, which obviously you don't, and I almost don't. Um, I spend far too much time on the internet, and if you spend far too much time on the internet, you'd be forgiven for thinking that, yes, that there is no normal anymore. But actually, I mean, I live in small town Britain, and there very much is a normal. Most normal people are still pretty normal. People walk their dogs and go to the pub and do normal jobs and have normal opinions. I find it, and I love it here because of that. I'm not surrounded by people who are ostentatiously trying to flout or subvert the status quo all the time. People just getting on with life. But if you spend all your time on the internet, you'd absolutely get the impression that there is no such thing as normal anymore. And I think in some contexts it's kind of true. I mean, in terms of public policy terms, there's a very strong sort of political policy pressure against the idea that the state should put its weight behind any particular form of normal. I mean, I don't know how true that is in Australia, but it's certainly true in the United Kingdom. I mean, the Conservative MP Danny Kruger and the MP Miriam Cates have come under a lot of fire relatively recently. For Danny said something. He made a defence of the normative family, which is to say, married heterosexual couples, intact families raising children, and was absolutely roasted to high heaven, including by his own side. Matt Hancock said that to state that even that such family was even normal constituted, was a completely fringe view in his party, despite the fact that, I mean, if you were to throw a wet haddock into a group of dog walkers local to where I live in small town Britain, they would absolutely tell you that a married, intact, heterosexual couple raising children is the normative family. That's just what it is. And the fact that there are a great many single parents who do a superb job in sometimes challenging circumstances doesn't make that any less true. But the point that there's a kind of official, if you like, an elite consensus against the idea that there is such a thing as normal, and there's a policy consensus against the belief that normal exists. And I would even go as far as to say that in some more avant-gardist or progressive quarters, there's an active effort, this sort of active ideological effort to undermine the idea that there is such a thing as a normal, which goes all the way down even to biological levels. Sort of technological war on normal human reproduction, for example, and the technological war on normal in a whole host of other fields beside. I mean, biotech is a whole. I mean, well, I don't want to go down the biotech rabbit hole, but I can't think of a more literal war on the idea of biological norms than setting out to edit them at the genetic level. So yeah, I mean, it depends who you ask, I think is the long answer to your question. Is there such a thing as normal anymore? It depends. If you ask your average dog walker in small town England, they will absolutely say there is. If you ask somebody in front of a camera who's a member of parliament, they will probably try and fudge the question because they'll get absolutely burned at the stake if they try and make any statement that suggests that there is.
It's very profound insight there, of course, in that. What you're really highlighting is the difference now between the elites, who are really quite disdainful of the common person and the common community. Disdainful is not too strong a word in my view, but the response is despair and disdain from those who feel that the elites patronise them and don't think their views are worthy. Of course, in Britain, in some ways, that played out with Brexit, but it hasn't gone away. And my impression is that many people would feel that the experts simply refuse to learn. They refuse to listen. They refuse to learn. They refuse to take the views of the mainstream, the views that most people would say have stood the test of time seriously. And I wonder just how corrosive all of this is in the end for the body politic.
Very much so. It's absolutely corrosive for body politic. Whether it's going to improve anytime soon, I think is an open question. I'm not optimistic, to be honest, John. And the reason I'm not optimistic is that we all like the idea of democracy and the people having a vote and the people really determining how things go. I was deeply dispirited to read Peter Turchin's recent effort Well, he's arguing essentially that America is on its way to a revolutionary condition based on other previous polities that have found themselves with those structural conditions, too many elites, but one of the most salient things that he points to is not enough of a mechanism. He has this grand sort of historical view of how polities can end up in disruptive and chaotic internal situations, and his argument is that one of the factors that drives that is too many elites who are competing for the top spot, but also among elites an ability to funnel wealth and resources and opportunities upwards to themselves without any countervailing means from the masses, if you like, to stop them. And I think in that sense, when I look at Britain and I look really at the entire developed world, that's what I see in position. There simply is no obvious mechanism for the people to hold the elite feet to the fire and say, hang on a minute, you can't do this. I think there was a point, and by that I mean sort of real. I don't mean being able to vote. That's kind of the icing on the cake. What I mean is substantive. So what I mean is leverage. If you think about when women were granted the franchise, that was after the First World War in Britain. That was largely as a consequence of the fact that women's work was needed because so many men had been killed. So it was simply not tenable to say, well, we need you to fill some of these roles that men have filled before, but we're also not going to let you vote. It just wasn't possible anymore. So women at that point had the leverage to demand the vote. But I think it doesn't matter how much lip service we want to pay to the idea of democracy if that doesn't come with a corresponding amount of leverage. It's just your vote just isn't going to mean very much. And I think about industrialization in particular in that context, and I think about the future as sketched by futurists like Yuval Noah Harari, where he imagines that automation in particular is just going to render a large sections of the body politic functionally just irrelevant. Under those circumstances, it's not obvious to me why somebody at the top of the political hierarchy would pay any attention at all to how the masses vote. I mean, who cares? They can vote for whatever they want, but if they can't actually do anything when it's ignored, if they don't actually have any means of if they can't withhold their labour through strikes, and there is no industry anymore because it's all been outsourced, and in fact most of the wealth in the country comes through financial services, which is concentrated in one tiny area. Who cares what they think? I mean, it literally doesn't matter from a sort of realist point of view. It literally doesn't matter, and I think that's what briefly seemed not to be true after the Brexit vote, and that's what, if you look at what has happened, in what people have done rather than what they said since the Brexit vote, I think that's pretty demonstrably the case. It literally doesn't matter what the vast majority of the electorate thinks because they don't have any leverage, and until that changes, and I see no obvious way for it to change, then I don't know. I'm not optimistic that anything particularly is going to the disdain that actually is very palpable, I think, from at least some quarters in government, is going to modify with anything more listening, with more listening or more of a genuflection to popular desires. I don't see it changing.
And into all of this mess comes something that I think you touched on, and I think you've also said that you found much of it not very useful. I would suggest that perhaps it was more than useless. It's actually very dangerous. The idea of, critical theory, critical race theory, critical gender theory, critical fat theory, critical queer theory. This is extraordinary stuff. And as Steven Pinker's pointed out, the idea that it's not only taken hold in academia, but is now spreading out into the community, and it finds its way into the education system, into the entertainment industry, into politics, and now business as well. How can there be any normal if we base our lives around the concepts of critical theory, in particular that the world's great problem is white supremacy?
Critical race theory, that whole architecture of grievance studies and white supremacy. I post all that that bit of post-colonialism and critical race theory sort of post-dated me, I think, in the academy. So I'm actually not massively familiar with the texts. I mean, I was inculcated, I suppose, into kind of 90s and noughties postmodernism, which was a very slightly different beast. But at the risk of getting too theoretical, I don't think all of the insights of postmodernism are wrong. Not all of them. There's the basic insight of standpoint epistemology, I think, is right. I have blind spots, but based on my own life experience and where I stand, and what is or isn't easily available to me politically, based on who I am and where I exist, how I show up in the world. I think that's fundamentally probably accurate. There are, the idea that language and power inflect how we perceive reality. Is basically accurate. But I think what's the difficulty is that it doesn't follow from that that the world doesn't exist. It doesn't follow from that we construct everything sort of ex nihilo based on human it doesn't follow that we exist in a consensus reality and there's nothing of substance underneath. Reality is still there. It's just a little bit inflected by factors, some of which are in our control, but most of which are not. So what? I mean, we still have to exist in the world. I still inhabit my body and nobody else's body. I'm still female, and there's nothing I can do about that. There's if you like the basic critical theory insights. I don't know. I look at some of the theories that have evolved out of this, and they sort of fit my basic rule of thumb about new innovative political theories, which is that it's reliably true that whatever means, whatever form they make their way out into the world in, will be the most stupid, reductive, and eventually counterproductive form possible. So you can come up with the most brilliant, subtle, far-reaching, observant, insightful new theories that you like for why we are the way they are. But by the time they percolate out to the people in general, they're just going to be dumb slogans. That's just unfortunately true. And I look at, again, the insights of queer theory or critical race theory, and the original postmodernists were not wrong about a lot of stuff. It's just that it's percolated out into the world in general in the form of sort of imbecilic slogans and profoundly destructive policies and nostra. And I think what it's been sort of digested by rank after rank after rank of sort of midwit, third-rate scholars, until it just becomes a set of idiotic slogans, which then percolate out into HR departments and become really nothing very good. I suppose this is Mary's elite theory again, isn't it? But this time I'm arguing for the elites rather than against them, as I was a minute ago. Make up your mind, Mary. It's extraordinary how much of an impact the idiotic and reductive versions, or how much of a hold these have come to have over public policy. Even in countries where they don't obviously fit, or where it would seem sensible to come up with your own version. I mean, America's a unique polity in its race politics. Its history. Its status both as a settler nation and also as a former slaving colony makes it surely unique, and also the world's only superpower. That's a completely unique cocktail. And America's, I visit America quite a lot. I talk to people a lot there about politics, and it's clear that the race politics there are bitter and intractable, and they don't seem to be improving. Notwithstanding 50 years of sincere and concerted efforts to improve them. That's regrettable, and I feel for America in having this kind of original sin to try and grapple with. But it doesn't follow from that what makes that the theories and the sort of radical approaches and the theories which have emerged in among American progressives to try and make sense of what's happening in America should be propagated throughout the world. But because it's the world's only superpower, and because it's such a media hegemon as well as being such a political hegemon, that's inevitably what ends up happening, because that's just how empires work, right? And even if America isn't officially an empire in a cultural sense, it 100% is. And so the the rest of the Anglosphere ends up being infected with ideas that only really make sense within the American polity. A friend of mine, Tom Owalad, wrote a book about that recently. He tried to he did his best to unpick. I mean, he's of immigrant heritage and African heritage, I believe. He's doing his best to unpack just how badly American critical race theory makes sense in the context of the United Kingdom, which again, our race politics are complicated and not always happy. But our history is different, and the origin stories of immigrant communities, white communities in the United Kingdom is completely different. It's just we just don't have the same backstory at all, and so. But it's extraordinarily difficult in our kind of unified Anglosphere media ecosystem, where it's very difficult to disaggregate the English political argument from the American political argument on the internet, because they all just kind of happen in the same placeless place. It's extremely difficult to disaggregate arguments about race in Britain from arguments about race in America. And inevitably, they end up sort of cross-pollinating one another. And a lot of the times, I think that's incredibly counterproductive. And I don't know, or I'm not very familiar with those kinds of arguments in Australia, but I dare say they happen. And I dare say that as well in Australia, they're inflected by what gets pumped out of the world's cultural hegemon, and that's. I'd be surprised if that's any more useful to Australians than it is to British.
Well, it is here, and in some ways it's very unhelpful. So in a way of summarising what I think you've just put before us, let me test this on you, would be to say that if a school of thought called a critical race theory establishes rightly that the statistics reveal that some people, and perhaps there's a race element to it, are privileged, that may be true, and that may be something you ought to deal with appropriately, but you can also deal with it inappropriately. The inappropriate way is to burn the house down, so to speak, in a sort of let's get even sort of mindset, let's tear the place down. The more constructive place would be to say, well, if you're privileged, you ought to be aware of it. You ought to be prepared to double your efforts to do the right thing for other people who are not so fortunate. The noblesse oblige idea that seems to have been washed out of our culture altogether. Would that be a way of sort of understanding what you were saying about the value of some of these understandings versus the conclusions and actions that arise out of those understandings?
Well, I suppose I hadn't really included the privilege theme in my reflections so far, but I think it's fair to say that the sort of critical studies argument is that we should be doing our best to dismantle privileges. That's a sort of central central tenet of the grievance studies, if you like. We should be doing our best to dismantle privileges. No one seems to want to contemplate the possibility that possibly we can't. And that there are some which are simply immovable because they're. I mean, I'm fond of saying. I'm sorry, I'm going to start us off down another rabbit hole, John. That a great deal in the 21st century, at least, I don't think it was always true. People talk a lot about patriarchy. Feminists talk about patriarchy, and it's. I've come to think over time that in a world where actual patriarchy has been largely dismantled, what we actually end up talking about when we talk about patriarchy is immutable sex differences that we don't like. And the bottom line is that there are some asymmetries which are just not going to go away between the sexes. To what extent that's true across other axes of privilege, I don't know. I think we could be here a very long time and get into some very radioactive territory if we were to explore that. So let's not go there. But the central question, I suppose, is what if we can't dismantle the architecture of privilege? What if there are always going to be elites? And I mean, this is Peter Turchin's argument that there will always be elite, because you can't have a functioning polity unless you have a ruling class. And if you have a ruling class, then there will probably be some asymmetries in it in terms of its demographics, or in terms of who's wielding the power, and there are some perverse incentives in play. And given that, it seems plausible that we're not going to be able to get away with architectures of privilege. We might be able to, and some people accuse the critical studies people of knowing that perfectly well and simply wanting to dismantle the existing architecture of privilege and replace it with their own. And I think if you look at what they do rather than what they say, there's probably some truth in that. It's not about making everybody the same. It's just about redirecting the engines of patronage from one set of one demographic to another. That's in that case, it's sort of in a sense, it's simply the latest delivery mechanism for politics as usual. And I think I find that argument quite convincing personally. But I mean, is privilege something, is thinking about privilege something we should replace with reflecting on noblesse oblige? Yes, absolutely. Again, this comes back to the Turchin insight about the relationship between elites and the wealth pump and political stability and the masses in general. It comes back to the idea that fundamentally, if you're going to have a ruling class that has a sort of functional and stable relationship to the masses in general, then a measure of a pragmatic measure of concession is, or if you prefer, noblesse oblige, is sensible, because otherwise sooner or later there'll be a revolution and somebody else will be, and you'll be replaced with somebody else. And so there are solid realist reasons again for noblesse oblige.
I suppose what I'm saying is that more than anything else, just saying there's always a useful and constructive approach which helps, if you like, build opportunity and human flourishing versus a response which ultimately proves to be atomising and destructive. That was really the only point that I was seeking to establish there.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you there. I think this idea that we're going to be any better off simply by burning everything down is demonstrably not true. And all it really does is replace one architecture of privilege with a different one. And you can plausibly end up just throwing a lot of babies out with the bathwater in the process.
Coming to your most recent book, in Feminism Against Progress, I understand you speak of what you call progressive theology. Interesting terms or term. What do you mean by it?
Well, by progress theology, I mean the belief, and I think it's a belief, not a fact, that progress theology. I simply mean the belief that things can go on getting better indefinitely, on any axis you care to name. I haven't set out to argue that case in detail in the book, because it's more of a kind of starting point for everything else which follows. But in I think the first chapter, I make the claim. There are plenty of other great books you can read that argue against the belief in progress. And I think one of the famous ones is Christopher Lasch, who writes a book titled "The True and Only Heaven," where he gives an analysis of the American belief in progress. But I've taken as a starting point for the book the claim that this is not a fact; it's a belief. If you like, it's an ordering belief. That out of which politics and behaviour and social structures and so on then flow. The idea that progress is a thing. I don't believe in it. The starting point really for all of the reflections that I've laid out in the book is that I lost my faith. I stopped believing in progress theology. I just came to think it was not true, and it did feel a lot like losing my faith. Because it's a very metaphysical belief that has strong trace connections to the Christianity which birthed it. I mean, in a sense, progressivism is a kind of Christian heresy, in that without Christianity we don't have the idea of history having any sort of directionality to it at all. The idea that you get over an enormously long arc from creation through the fall to salvation, to the end times, to the day of judgment, and then finally to heaven on earth, or heaven, everything, and finally rejoining our Maker. I mean, that's the fundamental Christian sort of spiritual narrative, the Christian eschatology, and the progressive eschatology is kind of the same. It just abstracts the spiritual elements from it. and implies that we can achieve all of that here on earth. But it's fundamental, structurally, it's the same eschatology as the Christian one. So it's deeply religious in nature. It's deeply religious in origin. It's so pervasive in the culture today as to be just part of the air that we breathe. The idea that things can get better and things can and should get better. I mean, it's difficult to think of a political party, even on the conservative side, that doesn't, or a think tank, or that does use the language of moving forward, of going forwards rather than backwards. And forwards is always better by definition. And I mean, it's just everywhere. Once you start looking for it, you see progress theology everywhere. It's simply how we make sense of the world.
I agree.
And it's not the only one. I mean, you don't have to look very far outside the Christian West to find plenty of cultures. Plenty of cultures that just don't think about life and the world and history in those terms at all. I mean, there are plenty of other ways of making sense of the world. The Chinese and the Indians have a completely different religious sort of metaphysical architecture for how they make sense of the big sweep of time. But the progressive one is fundamentally a Christian one in its structure, and it's just there everywhere. And I stopped believing in it. I just don't think it's a thing. The specific architecture of attaining heaven on earth over the course of history is just not true.
So to be a little bit provocative or even cheeky, I'd be interested in your views. I suspect a lot of people are realising that there's not much room for progressive theology now. The evidence is suggesting that we're not going to see it in our lifetimes. There's a lot of despair in Western societies. We know that from the research. That's easy to see. So we've rejected Christianity. The theology of progress is sort of looking pretty unappetizing, unreal, unachievable at the moment. Where do we find hope now?
Well, I don't think we have rejected progress theology as the thing. I mean, it's certainly percolating from the ground up. People are beginning to have some questions about how well it's borne out by reality. But people at the top, to the extent that people are insulated from stagnation, from political unrest, from street crime, etc., and so on. To the extent that people are insulated from that, they tend still to believe in progress. And I think you can see that in the socioeconomic breakdown of how people vote. And I'd be willing to bet that similar patterns are visible in Australia as in the United Kingdom. That people are more likely to vote for socially progressive parties the wealthier they are, because the counter argument isn't happening all around to quite such an extent. So you can still have hope. You can still believe that, if only we fiddle with the policy and give people even fewer restrictions and even less of a set of social norms, then perhaps we will attain heaven on earth. And I think that it's still believable if you live in some peaceful, pleasant places where those policies haven't been implemented fully enough yet. It becomes increasingly obvious where they have been implemented that that's not really what happens. But yeah, progress is a belief. It's not a fact. Where do we find hope after peak progress? Oh, that's a big question. That's a big question. I mean, I always have hope. But I mean, there are so many books that I didn't write when I set out to write Feminism Against Progress. I mean, this was my learning arc. In writing my first book, I thought I was going to have a chance to say everything, and it turns out that actually 50,000 words is nearly enough. You have to be every bit as selective about what you want to say. And so there was a book about the end of peak oil and the end of fossil fuels, which is coming. I mean, even the most ardent climate denialist will have to accept that the just in terms of mass, the amount of fossil fuel available to power our energy throughput is finite, right? And when it runs out, a huge amount of stuff is going to go with it, because I remain unconvinced that either nuclear or renewables or anything is going to be any sort of a functioning replacement. That's going to do interesting things to economic growth. It's going to do interesting things to our political, our financial architectures and our social architectures and our behavior. Yeah, it's utterly world shattering, reality shattering, and that's a whole. And it has implications for feminism as well. That was the original book I set out to write about the dissonance between the women's movement and the environmental movement, which seems obvious to me, in as much as a great deal of women's liberation is predicated on the existence of labour-saving technologies, which is true. The end of easily available consumer goods and labour-saving technologies implies the necessity of quite a radical rethink of women's liberation, and that's a whole other book which I didn't have an opportunity to write. Where do I find where do I find hope? I think big changes are coming, likely in my lifetime, probably in both of our lifetimes. They're already here. Progress in the theological sense is, sometimes I think it really is as reductive as, what we think, what we mean when we point to progress is actually mostly energy throughput, which is mostly fossil fuels. And the less of the latter we have, the less of the former we're going to have. And in as much as I have hope, it's because humans are astonishingly adaptable. We've been around for a long time, and this wouldn't be the first civilization to come and go. And with humans carrying on in one form or another, I don't think we're heading for a sort of human, planetary scale human extinction event. I think there's a solid chance that this particular way of this particular form of humans existing on the planet is not going to last indefinitely. But are we going to prevail one way or another? Probably. And will we find new ways of flourishing together? Probably. I mean, it's a very qualified sort of an optimism, but I have immense faith in adaptability and creativity and robustness. And in as much as a lot of the things which I critique are also inseparable from the high energy throughput extractive civilizational paradigm that we exist in, maybe it won't be all bad. I think a lot of it's going to suck making the trans. I remember expressing all of this to a conservative local to me, who said, the thing to remember, Mary, is if you read Gibbon, you read it quite quickly, but actually all of that stuff happened over quite a long period of time. And if you were living through the fall of the Roman Empire, you probably just most of the people who lived through the fall of the Roman Empire actually led fairly peaceful lives. It was just that some things changed, and not all of them for the better. And maybe that's what we're looking at now. There's plenty of opportunities still to lead good. I mean, there are always plenty of opportunities to lead good and decent lives, even if the world as we know it is in fact going to an end. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's the hopeful message you were looking for.
Well, I think what I would take out of that is a powerful reminder that in the end, not only are we adaptive, but when you come back to basics, you start to think about what really matters. Surely in the end, the thing to recognise is we're not only adaptive, we're relational. We're relational human beings. So I'd like to come to
absolutely
on that. So
just absolutely. I think the angle that I've taken on all of these questions in the book is to underline the fact that if we're going to weather some potentially quite bumpy transitional years to come, which few people would dispute, given the sort of rolling polycrisis. One of the from a feminist point of view, from the point of view of pursuing women's interests, actually the point to retrench to and to refocus on is solidarity, solidarity between the sexes, and rebuilding, perhaps setting down some of our belief that we can and should always be trying to go it alone, and refocusing on how we can show up for one another.
Well, I'm quoting you directly here. You wrote, by the end of your 20s, I had concluded that sexual freedom brings alienation. Alienation means, amongst other things, loneliness, I suppose, a breaking of relationships. What did you know and understand by your late 20s that you hadn't seen in your mid to late teens, if I can put it that way?
I suppose I'd just done a bit more dating. I prefer to draw a veil over the gory details, because none of it was especially great or fun or long lasting. Yeah, I experimented some. I experimented plenty. Um, came came grimly to the conclusion that if you prioritize endless optionality, by which I mean always having the opportunity to walk away and to be somewhere new. I suppose the modern this was all before the dating apps, but this has been literalized for a generation or so younger than me by the existence of dating apps, where you can just scroll and find a new potential sexual partner, pretty much as though you're shopping on Amazon. So in a sense, the all the incentives now work against the idea of finding somebody and settling down with them, because you have all of these things beeping on your phone reminding you that there's plenty more fish in the sea. But I suppose even prior to that, this sort of the moral architecture for that basic paradigm was already there, and I suppose had been sort of developing since the sexual revolution. And it's but if you take as your sort of basic your core belief, the idea that there are always plenty more fish in the sea, then you're never really going to make much of an effort to compromise with another person. You're never going to make much of an effort to find somebody with the kind of traits that would suit a long-term relationship. You're never gonna be filtering for you'll be filtering for fun, or you'll be filtering for novelty, or you'll be filtering for emotional intensity, or you'll be filtering for all sorts of things which make for great anecdotes, or an interesting weekend, but not necessarily what makes for lifelong partnership. And I suppose I did that for a while, and it was interesting, and made for some great anecdotes and some fun weekends. But not really, not necessarily for, well, definitely not for lifelong partnership. And I can't remember the point exactly where I made a more or less conscious decision to think about it differently, but I did. At some point, I can remember dating like that, and then I can remember realizing that I was effectively, in quite an old-fashioned way, dating to marry. And I don't remember that being a particularly conscious decision, but I think my grandma's advice probably did play into it. At that point, I realized I was just filtering for quite a different set of things in the people who I was wanting to spend some time with. No regrets. It was the best thing I could possibly have done, was to adjust my paradigm in that way. The advice I tend to give people who younger women who ask me about this now is, don't wait, don't be me, don't spend your 20s doing that if you're certain that what you want is a settled family life. Be clear about how you should be thinking about it. And don't waste your time with charming losers or sketchy guys or players. Don't do that, because it's not going to do you any good, and you'll end up you'll just end up where I did, with as many miles on the clock as I did, and that's not necessarily the best way to start married life either. I don't know. I mean, it's sort of slightly battered and bruised advice to the younger generation. Whether or not any of them will listen to my suggestion on that front, I don't know. My sense is that relations between the sexes now have got so embittered. Again, this might just be a case of not going outside enough. And for all I know, there are plenty of young people who are doing just fine. But my sense is that the culture percolating out of the internet is actively counterproductive where it comes to forming new relationships and forming long-term relationships. And I do wonder as well whether there isn't more that older generations, particularly older women, could be doing to push against that. And I think if we leave family formation up to the dating apps, we're basically screwed. It's all of us collectively, because we won't be putting our heads together. But older people won't have been doing what we should be doing to support family formation among the young. I don't think they should be left entirely to their own devices. Traditionally, it's been interfering in the romantic lives of younger men and women has been absolutely the preserve of the middle-aged like me, and to a very modest degree. I meddle in the romantic lives of friends who are somewhat younger than me. My great friend Louise Perry, another reactionary feminist, has recently taken to organising singles nights because she had so many young men and women write to her saying, how on earth am I meant to find a partner? That she ended up organising a sort of Deb's dance for her readership, which was apparently a great success. I mean, whether any marriages will come out of it or not, I don't know. But we've come to the conclusion that there's a missing piece of life interfering from, and it has to come from older women. I think I read recently about a conservative man who has set out to run basically a dating service for young conservative men and women in the United Kingdom. To me, that just seems weird. Like, the incentives are all wrong. Men shouldn't be involved in matchmaking. It just is. I just think that's the perverse the opportunity for things to go wrong and for perverse incentives is just way too great. And I think you have to have the typical married mother of however many. Abstract interest in interfering in people's personal lives to be able to do that at all healthy, but there's a missing social space there, where I think I think older women can potentially step up and do a bit more there. The missing aunties. Oh yeah, that was I remember a guy who I worked with once. He was Indian hair. He was British Asian, and he was being carted around the British Asian arranged marriage circuit while we were working together. And he used to come in on a Monday morning and regale us with his exploits. And he used to talk about the aunties, and by that he meant the network of older women in his community, all of whom knew one another and gossiped with one another. He didn't just mean his father and mother's siblings, but auntie is a sort of honorific which encompasses a much broader range of older women. It basically means like older women who feel entitled to meddle in your life. And it strikes me that there are aunties that are missing in our culture, and perhaps they drive us up the wall if we had them back, but also their absence leaves a gap.
Well, we may be missing uncles as well, I'd have to say, but I'd also want to just quite sincerely commend you on being courageous enough to be vulnerable and courageous enough to be honest, because I'm sure there are people everywhere looking for aunts. Well done. I think that's terrific. You mentioned your friend Louise Perry. I think she commented that the arrival of a new baby is not just about the creation of a baby, a new human being. It's also of something else that's new, usually. It creates parents. You've been through that experience. I understand, the first baby was a big moment. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I think, yes, absolutely. I think that was really, if losing my faith started this trajectory, having a baby completed it. In the side, I already had some questions about progress theology, but having a baby was kind of the nail in the coffin for that basic paradigm. Because if there's if progress theology has an end point, it's complete individualism. That's the telos of progress. Things getting better to the extent that people become more and more free, I think would be a sort of reductive, a sort of crude but fairly accurate summary of that belief. To the extent that people become more and more free to be themselves, then we are making progress. And after I had a baby, I came to think that more and more free is not a good enough, it's not a rich enough summary of what it means to be a person in relationship with others. So in the sense that if you have a baby, you're considerably less free. But it didn't feel like a step backwards. And I had to do my best to make sense of that. And it was literally visceral experience. I mean, I grew my daughter in my literal viscera. And became, and it's a very literal experience of becoming less free. You're functionally disabled by the time you're heavily pregnant. You need help getting up and down. Some people literally are, and have to get around on crutches because it messes with their hips. You're heavy and you're ponderous, awkward, and I never ever want. We were renovating our house at the time, and I had to repaint the banisters up and down the stairs while 8 months pregnant, and I never want to do that again because it was so uncomfortable. So trying to paint trying to get into these awkward corners around this enormous bump that's kind of that's part of your midsection is just horrible. But it was all worth it, because then you got this amazing new little person, and what was so extraordinary about it, and what I just had no idea about. The real kind of going through the looking glass moment was when I realized, she felt like she'd been just part of my body, getting more and more kind of palpably part of my body for 9 months. And then after she was born, she didn't stop feeling like part of my body. And that just completely melted just blew all of my assumptions out of the water. It was as though I'd grown an extra limb. And then that limb was somehow weirdly detached from me and still needed looking after. And the desire to look after her well-being was as strong as the desire would be to look up to make sure my own arms and legs are okay. It's that immediate. The idea that something could harm or injure your child after they've been inside your body for 9 months is as immediate and totally all-consuming as the instinctive desire to look after your own extremities. And the idea that harm could come to them is just horrific. At exactly the same level, and it messes with your it's a totally mind-altering experience becoming a mum at an absolutely physiological level. It literally rewires your brain. It completely changes your hormonal makeup, so you totally transforms your outlook on life. And I felt merged, completely completely merged with my baby for some time, and that only wears off very gradually. I think my daughter was a year and a half old before I felt comfortable being away from her for any length of time. And I know there are plenty of mums who have to be apart from their babies at a much younger age than that. But I think it's more often than not, it's a real wrench to do it. People get used to it, but it sucks because that's not the basic instinctive desire. The instinctive desire is more to be around, is to feel that sense of fusion. And I think it's a challenging experience when you've been raised to believe that separateness and autonomy is the ultimate moral good and is by definition evidence of progress. Because on the one hand, you value your autonomy. I still prize my autonomy, and a great many women do. And on the other hand, you have this basic kind of animalistic, pre-rational sense of merger with this completely dependent little human being, and it's very difficult to make those two things add up. Women struggle with this in all sorts of different ways, and some just throw themselves into the mummy thing, and some really struggle. But it's very rare to find a modern woman who doesn't really grapple with that paradox. And what I set out to try and make sense of when our starting point for writing Feminism Against Progress was just trying to grapple with that paradox. How have we ended up with a culture, sort of a completely accepted ideology that just suffuses the culture from top to bottom, which is so constitutively at odds with the experience of being a mother? How did we end up there? And how has that become so identified with feminism, which is meant to be the political movement that pursues women's interests? When the majority of women still are mothers, how did we end up with a women's movement that has such a mother-shaped blind spot? And I realized as I dug into it that's less than accurate. That in fact feminism doesn't have a mother-shaped blind spot. That the women's movement has always engaged in a very rich and fractious way with the question of being a mother. It's that the dominant, the prevailing, the line that comes through, the line that wins out again and again and again, is the one that excludes that sense of relationality and that sense of maternality. And I set out to answer the question, how do we end up there? Why is it that care is always the poor relation? Why is it that mothering is always the poor relation? Why are mothers marginalized? Why do the maternal feminists get a little marginal footnote, and the liberation feminists get the main history book? Why does that keep happening? And the rest of the book sets out to answer that question and a few other ones besides. But yeah, that was really that was how I started, how I found myself trying to answer that question as well, because I really prized I believed wholeheartedly up to that point that more freedom was always by definition better. And then I found myself in a situation where exercising my freedom to not get up in the night and feed my screaming child was just not, that was unthinkable. This idea that more freedom would say that actually you should have a right to just lie there and say, no, I don't want to. But it's just not true. No, it doesn't feel true. And everybody, most common sense would say that would be just obviously wrong. And something would have obviously gone very wrong in your postpartum mental health if you were just lying there listening to your hungry child screaming, and saying, no, I'm not going to get up and feed them because I don't want to, and I should have my freedom to not do it. People would look at a mother who was behaving like that and say, you're right. Something's obviously gone very wrong. Yeah. But it's a lot to adjust to, when the entire culture has basically been lying to you up to that point about how humans actually work.
The idea of individual freedom in the end seems to involve an enormous amount of selfishness for a lot of people. And I think in a sense you've touched on it. You said something very interesting. You said it was 18 months before you felt comfortable being separated from your daughter. And you're able to articulate that. Your child at that age can't. At what age do you think your daughter might have been comfortable being separated from you?
Well, this is the question. I mean, it's a very that's an incredibly moving target, because it's sort of how much separation and who's there in the meantime and for how long, and yeah, but what's the environment like during separation? That's such a moving target that it's very difficult to give a definitive answer to that. I can remember sort of borderline having a panic attack when my daughter was, I think, 4 or 5 months old, and I just had to go to the dentist, and the dentist was running late, and so she'd woken up from her nap by the time I got home. But my mum was like, and I should have, it was fine because my mum was there, and she my daughter was fine, but I completely freaked out. I was sitting there in the waiting room, just like, because I knew, the idea of my daughter waking up and me not being there, not being able to be there for her when she was awake was just so appalling. But that was sort of 4 or 5 months old, and by the time she was but by the time she was 2, it was a completely different ballgame. She'd be perfectly happy with somebody else, a trusted other who I knew was fine and who I knew would care for her and who she knew. She'd be fine for a few hours to be with somebody else. It's a very, but if I left her on her own with strangers for a whole day at the age of 2, she'd have absolutely hated it. So it depends on so many different things. At what age is it fine to? I mean, anecdotally, and this is a very not scientific sample of just some mums who had children about the same time as I did. In Britain, relative to some countries, we have fairly generous maternity provision in that, if you can take 6 months paid and 6 months unpaid. And so most mothers who can afford it will go back to work after about a year. I think it's, anecdotally, that's too soon. A 12-month-old baby is still a baby. And most of the mothers who I spoke to about it would have preferred 18 months. Because I don't know what it is that changes around then, but, they could a bit more exploring and a bit more verbal and a bit more noticing and a bit more interested in the world around them, and a bit more separation, and starts to feel emotionally plausible at about 18 months. But it depends on so many other factors that I think it's difficult to give a defining answer. But I mean, what I absolutely do know is that whatever the horrible statistic is, like 1 in 4 or something mad like that, of American babies who are put into daycare at 2 weeks old is just horrendous. That's absolutely not an age at which babies should be separated from their mothers. I mean, it's not even legal to separate puppies from their mothers at 2 weeks old. So why we imagine it would be okay to do that to human children who develop so much more slowly is completely beyond me. It's barbarous.
Wow, interesting way of putting it. Another quote: women will succeed at feminism only insofar as we succeed at not being mothers. It suggests that you see a contradiction between the goals of feminism and the calling of motherhood. You've touched on that. How do you think the leaders of this sort of argument reconcile it with something else you've referred to, which is that most mothers would instinctively feel the need to spend more time with their young?
I I'm going to go back to that quote and just nuance it a little bit, because it's in. I made that statement in the context of a much broader argument. Women will succeed at feminism to the extent that that we're not mothers. Applies specifically to what I think of as the dominant victorious strand of this movement, which is what you might call magazine feminism, which is what we live with in the mainstream now, which is the feminism of freedom, which is, and I just want to underline the fact that it's not the only feminism ever. And in the book, I went into some depth on retrieving some other feminisms which preceded it. I think there's a hugely interesting body of work among 19th century women in responding to the Industrial Revolution in a whole host of different ways, lots of which are not intelligible in the terms of 21st century feminism, because they were not the feminisms of freedom. So there's a whole lot more to it than, women will succeed at feminism to the extent that we're not mothers. But that is the dominant strand that we've ended up with today. It's one which prizes autonomy over relationality, and sees that as, by definition, what's going to be better for women. How are mothers meant to flourish under that paradigm? What are we meant to do? How are we meant to make sense of it? How are we meant to? I think that that's it. You can very easily get into the weeds on policy about when it comes to, because so many of these questions really are concrete, and there's a school of thought that says the solution, the way of squaring this circle is the way of squaring the circle is more childcare, and then there are others who say no, actually the way of squaring the circle is making it more affordable for mothers to stay at home, and the answer is probably both. The Catherine Hakim was a sociologist, sort of lightly cancelled, I suppose, who did some great research on this in the noughties, and has argued persuasively, I think, that based on her research, roughly 60, it breaks down roughly 60-40, or 60-20-20. So if you ask women, all other things being equal, what would you prefer? Would you rather spend most of your time at work? Would you rather spend most of your time at home? Or would you rather have a mixture of the two? And maybe roughly 20% would just want to prioritize work. And some of those won't have kids. And some of those will just put their kids in full-time daycare. Another 20% would just like to be full-time mums. Would I say just? It's a entirely noble and legitimate course of action. But roughly 20% would like to spend their whole time being stay-at-home mums. The rest, the remaining 60% would like a balance, please. So that is the majority of women would like some life and so some things going on outside the home, one form or another, and would also like to have plenty of time to be available to their kids. And to me, that seems like anecdotally, that feels about right. That there are some women who are just not very interested in being mums. Some women for whom that's life, and the rest, we're kind of muddling through one way or another. And and I think that's, to me, that would be a good basis for getting into the weeds on policy. To think that actually for the most part, if we're to try and find a solution that sort of roughly fits how people normally are, can we try and find ways of supporting women to achieve that kind of a balance? Unfortunately, what seems to happen, partly because of partly in the interests of economic growth, and also partly in the interests of the way the 20% who really are mostly interested in work are overrepresented in policy making and legislation for obvious reasons. You have to be a pretty driven careerist to end up in those places, right? So because those women are overrepresented, they tend to universalize their own worldview and assume that that's what every woman is going to want. It's just not true. I mean, if you're a lawyer or a politician, then you're going to be much more. There's much more. You have a much more interesting set of work opportunities to sacrifice being with your kids for than if you're putting packets through a scanner. And yet, unfortunately, once you roll out policies that would be a good fit for a barrister, or I always come back to the example of barristers in this case, but a barrister or a doctor or a management consultant or whatever, and you roll those policies out all the way down the social scale, including to those women who have jobs rather than careers, then it's not obvious to me that you're really serving those women's interests. Yeah. So yeah, it's a complex. How you resolve that, I don't know. I mean, again, Miriam Cates, who I mentioned earlier in the British discourse, she's one of the very few. She's one of the very few politicians I've seen making the case. Sticking up for those women who have jobs rather than careers, and arguing for policies which would support women pursuing a balance rather than just ever more time in work. And for that, again, she gets brickbats. It's extraordinary, even from her own side. So the political forces ranged against what to me seems like a very centrist and common sense argument, supported by sociological research on what women actually prefer. The forces ranged against that are considerable, and it's unfortunate.
It's not only what women would prefer, it's what children need. And it seems to me that is simply almost never taken into the equation. And a society that doesn't look to the needs of its children is a society in the end with a death wish.
Yep, I could not agree more. And that goes a lot wider than the childcare question. I think children's needs are disregarded across a whole host of other, mostly very contentious topics, where from gestational surrogacy through to family formation, and the rights and wrongs of when you should or shouldn't try and keep your marriage together, through a whole down to areas which I'm not going to get into because they're just more radioactive than I think we have time for in this discussion.
Yeah, I agree. I do make the point sometimes, though, that I find it a terrible reflection on modern culture that we are so quick to judge those who have gone before us without examining who we're marginalising and whose lives we're discounting and whose lives we are not fully respecting. Because our culture does it just as the cultures we so readily criticise that have gone before us have done, it's just we do it in different ways. But to move on, because you're being very generous with your time, you've written a lot about personhood and transhumanism. I was just wondering if we could explore a couple of issues there as we come into land.
Yes, I mean, it's a theme I come back to again and again. I mean, if we're going to, we touched on this very early in the conversation when I talked about the technological war on normal, which I think is a governing theme of where we are now, really across the board. I mean, when politicians and visionaries and futurists talk about the fourth industrial revolution, that's fun. What they're talking about is biotech, and what they're talking about is a technological move into the sort of building blocks of life itself. Experiments re-engineering living creatures and potentially up to and including re-engineering human beings. And there are lots of live culture war issues at the moment concerning whether or how far we should be able to meddle with the human genetic structure, whether it's appropriate or right or even plausible to explore artificial gestation, whether it's appropriate or right to explore creating gametes in a laboratory out of other DNA. There was a report out recently about some Japanese scientists who'd successfully grown live mice out of cells created from the genetic material provided by two male mice. Obviously breathless headlines follow about gay couples being able to have children related to both parents, and you can accomplish all of this in a laboratory, and of course, and that sets off a whole question. Can we, and how safe would it be, and should we? And I mean, this is too huge and too complex an area really to get into in any detail. And the one thing I would say is that if your vision, as it does for the technologists, and I suppose particularly for the transhumanists, is predicated on the idea that normal is at best a baseline to improve on, and at worst an outright enemy of your personal freedom, then ultimately the group which will end up bearing the weight of your insistence on ultimately the group that will pay the price will be children. Because if you're experimenting with normal where it comes to creating new life, inevitably that's going to mean whenever those experiments go wrong, the individuals for whom it will most palpably go wrong will be the babies themselves. Whether that's embryos that you're creating and then euthanizing in a petri dish, or whether it's it's the first attempt to create a baby in an exo womb that turns out to be some horrific thing that needs to be euthanized. Ultimately, or whether it's babies raised in situations which are simply not developmentally appropriate for babies. The horror scenarios are potentially limitless, and the suffering is almost all borne by those least able to shoulder it, because they're newborn babies or infants or completely defenseless. So but I'm gonna swerve the sort of bigger picture of transhumanism, and can we or should we try and remodel human norms, and just say that if you're the thing for me not to lose sight of when we talk about re-engineering humans, when re-engineering humans is who the most vulnerable really is in this context. And actually the most vulnerable in the context of human beings is always babies. And those are and it's the most vulnerable who are asked to pay the price when we set out to re-engineer ourselves.
Well, you've given us a very great deal to think about indeed. And perhaps at some stage it might be possible for us to reconvene to consider some of these matters as things unfold in the future. But for the time being, I can only thank you for your deep insights and your incredible honesty. I think the way in which you are prepared to, as I touched on a moment ago, be as honest and as vulnerable as you are means that there will be many who will be greatly encouraged, not just to think through carefully how they construct their own lives, their own relationships, but perhaps also to become champions for what might be called true freedom, which is never license.
Very true.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. It's been great.